I've asked permission to stand. As probably a lot of you, I am jet-lagged and hungry, so this will keep me up. And perfect time for some space poetry. I'm not just going to read poetry, actually, sorry. I'm going to talk a little bit about poetry. First of all, also thank you for being here. It's lovely to be backstage in this phenomenal place. And thank you, Thomas, for your slide. I am the only one here that did not bring slides. I'm the only one with papers. I was thinking I was going to a poetry festival maybe. But then I realized I would have to look at myself, both left and right. So I said, nah, I'll borrow some slides. And I like this, and it suits the story well, I suppose. So I also, maybe it's good to know, I publish a lot about space, but more from a philosophical, societal perspective. And I write poetry, so hence the space poetry. Actually, when I saw this card, I thought it would be so funny. I've never been to a poetry festival where there was a poetic astronomer. So if any of you would be interested, I can arrange that for you. But I think it's lovely that Evine asked the poet here. And actually, poetry and astronomy have always been very closely connected. Maybe some of you know that it was actually a poet, John Milton, who coined the term space to refer to the universe. So it's in Paradise Lost, his famous poem. So every time you say the word space, you are actually quoting a poem from the 17th century. And poetry has been, well, throughout the centuries, an answer to that vast universe and to all the mysteries. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I would like to mention two things that struck me or that I thought about during all the conversations I heard and that I would like to point out. And I think one of the things, so there's been a lot of zooming out here, which, of course, you are astronomers. We're talking about the James Webb Telescope. But I think zooming out really gains in significance when simultaneously you zoom in. And it was mentioned a little bit by Teresa today and other people also. But I think it's very important to take into consideration the daily realities at eye level, the politics, society. And standing here as a Dutch person, I can say that we had a very devastating outcome of the election last November. For the first time since the World War, we had a far-right party that had most seats. It's a racist party, it's an undemocratic party, and we will probably have a right-wing, very far right-wing government in the near future. Hopefully not, but we might. And as all of you know here, that's not a Dutch phenomenon. All over the world, populist parties, often racist parties, are feeding on the fear that's spiked by growing insecurities. And what this means is that the gaze in our society is actually turning inwards, and the mind is narrowing because of this. And over and over again, otherness and, well, you could call it alien things are framed as a threat. And I think in such dangerous times, the ultimate outward gaze of a telescope pointed to possible alien worlds, other worlds, is perhaps something as an antidote. And I know it's always tricky, you know, should you use something like this in a political way? Should you frame it politically? But I really think it is time to think about the political power something like this has, because it shows us the enormity that we are still part of. And it shows us how strange we are, how unique, but also maybe not unique, and just weird carbon-based creatures, and how strange the whole universe is. And I think it also shows us how very much dependent we are across the borders, as Teresa already mentioned, across all these man-made borders. So you could see the James Webb Telescope, looking through it, as an act of resistance, political resistance in these times. I'm not saying it should be the only thing, but I think you should consider it. And you know, it's a way of staying open for the otherness, for the alien that populist politicians are making us fear all over the world. So my second thought, this is something that I've been writing about a lot, and it worries me a lot. It was mentioned just a little bit in the talk of Piero Benvenuti. It's about the commercialization of space. I know it seems far off from something like the James Webb Telescope, but as you all know, more and more space is seen as a commodity from which private companies can profit. And of course, this raises huge moral questions, not only about ownership, but also about how, once we commercialize space, how we will relate to that universe that has always been primarily a source of science, a source of wonder, of poetry, of solace. And in recent years, actually, a lot of research shows that there is a growing feeling of alienation. We've just heard Hannah Arendt also pointed this out, so it's nothing new. Well, maybe it started with the Big Bang, but it's actually growing, and especially among young people. And I think it's not only the Big Bang that makes us feel alienated. It's actually also a worldview in which everything more and more is seen as a commodity for the use and gain of human beings only. And well, as you probably understand, by reducing forests and rivers and non-human animals to nothing more than resources, we take away the intrinsic values they have until they actually no longer mean anything besides something to consume. And it makes us consumers of a world, and that makes us lonely, because a world that has no story to tell or no intrinsic value is a silent world that does not talk back. So looking at everything as a commodity takes away the dialogue we can have with the world and with the universe, and the dialogue we have had as human beings for a long time. And now even space, asteroids, the moon, even that is turned into a commodity. And researching exoplanets, other forms of life perhaps, is a way of keeping the universe alive with non-commercial values, with intrinsic values. And I think that is very crucial in this time. It's keeping it alive as a source of wonder, a source of mystery, poetry. So again, it's an antidote. And I would like to suggest a slogan, maybe for your next conference, which is aliens against alienation. So short thing about poetry now. Someone who was very much in favor of this dialogue with the universe, with the world in general, is an astronomer. Perhaps someone here knows her. Her name was Rebecca Elson. She died in the 90s. She was working on the Hubble telescope, but she was also a poet, wrote a lot of poetry. And she actually said that she could not be an astronomer if she was not a poet at the same time. And here's just a few sentences of her that I love very much. She wrote, "We are survivors of immeasurable events, flung upon some reach of land, small, wet miracles without instructions, only the imperative of change." I really love that. And so in one of her poems, Rebecca Elson coined something like, or she wrote something like responsibility to awe. So like awe. I know I pronounce it weird. I'm from Holland. Awe. We say awe to children, like awe, but this is the awe. So anyway, she said we have a responsibility to awe, especially if you're an astronomer. So I'm not an astronomer, but I will take the responsibility as well since I'm here. And she said you have a duty to honor the poetry of astronomy. And she used that word responsibility, and I love that, because in the word, there's another word, which is response. And her responsibility was a form of responding to the universe, to the wonders that she saw, to the awe. And, seeing the pillars of creation, possible related planets, the birth of stars, we should, I think, and Rebecca Elson says, we should think about how to respond to all that magnificence. And I think that's important, to give science the depth that it needs. It's not only showing, it's not only sending, it's also thinking about the response, thinking about the conversation. And it's also a way to keep science where I think it belongs, very close to poetry. So near that sometimes it's impossible to distinguish between the two. And I can tell you, I've been listening to you for 2 days. I've heard a lot of poetry, some very, how do you call it? Like enigmatic poetry, hard to decipher sometimes, but also very poetic. It was lovely to you know, sometimes you don't even understand it, but the phrases, the words and the images were very poetic. So for Rebecca Elson, for me also, astronomy asks for an answer, for a dialogue, and it's not, as I said, about finding facts, it's about starting a conversation that actually keeps us connected with the universe that we inhabit. So to end off, I try to formulate some response to awe. I was thinking about, it's very hard for me to write poetry in English, so I wrote something in between, a letter that rhymes every now and then. It's in English, but I was thinking about this idea of response and reciprocity in astronomy. And I thought the thing that we haven't asked here, maybe it's a ridiculous question, but maybe not, is what's in it for the alien, right? If we find something, possibly, what is the, well, what would happen? What would we say? What would we bring if we don't only want to take something? And I thought in case we would be discovered someday by some other culture, at least we would want to know something about our discoverers. And as you all probably know, Carl Sagan, he's been mentioned a few times, he tried to reach out to possible alien intelligence with his golden records. You must all know that, they're at the Voyagers. But then you also probably know that he left out a lot of stuff because he had this conviction that a first impression should be a good impression. So there's no war, there's just smiling people eating grapes in the supermarket. Did you see what he sent? Because it's lovely, it's very poetic, but it's also ridiculous. I mean, the pictures are ridiculous. People like eating ice cream, like, what kind of planet is this? So anyway, it's nice to give a good impression, but I believe aliens deserve the whole truth. So I wrote this letter on account of all of us. Hope you agree. We can send it later. Yeah, to possible inhabitants of some far-off planet in a habitable zone. So, dear alien, how long before you come into view? Conversely, you may have had us in your sight for a long time. Us, a speck in your sky. I can't speak for all of humanity, but in general, that possibility is hard to stomach here. Our geocentric thinking forms us still. Our myths are formed with chosenness. We alone are the children of a son. We alone look back at God. It's crushing. The idea we might be some arbitrary collusion of the right ingredients, not the pinnacle of creation, not the guardians of stars, random wanderers in a remote galaxy with strange kin around another sun. You force us to ponder how to think beyond ourselves. Look at me, writing you, assuming singular existence on the other end of the line. While you might be 1,000 things, even 1,000 things at once, a collective moment, a large scale happening in some 12th dimension. I once asked an astronomer, how can we recognize extraterrestrial life? Her answer was, we probably can't. The overly alien eludes us. But you can learn, she said. You can learn by unlearning all you've learned. Make the strange familiar, the familiar strange. Regard this world with permanent amazement. Why this? Why so? Her words made me think of all those earthly beings, so close to us, and yet misunderstood. The wild fish on our plates, the wisdom of root systems, the slow language of metals, which we understand only as raw material for destructive growth. Why this? Why so? Our conversation with the world has become a boring monologue, but something resonates within us when we look upon the stars, the remnants of some giant melody. Somewhere in that void, we vibrate along. If we meet you, will we acknowledge what connects us? It can take ages for a human to recognize their neighbor, let alone a relative from billions of years away. And yet, we point lenses at the unknown. Like lost children, we peer into the dark. It's time someone finds us. With warm regards.